Second part of the question, Mr. Peter Hayde.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Entering this House after a high profile of a by-election is rather like I remember being head prefect at primary school only to be plunged into the obscure anonymity of a secondary school new boy. And I'm confident that after I sit down, that fate will await me. Could I say that it's an honour and privilege to represent Neath or Castich Nedd, whose importance dates from Roman and Norman times and has the cosiest town centre in Britain, surrounded by scenic valleys and beautiful waterfalls, with to the west the spectacular nighttime view of Pontedowie's unusually tall and striking church spire. There's a strong sense of community, an immense network of voluntary activity, and a rich culture of amateur opera, music, male and ladies' voice choirs. On the eastern tip of the constituency is Richard Burton's home village of Pontrhy-de-Ven. Amateur sport is widespread: football, athletics, and of course the best rugby team in the country. And I recall recently being introduced to a class of 9-year-olds at Godrigraig Primary School, and the teacher said, "Here is a very important person," to which a 9-year-old got up and said, "Do you play rugby for Neath?" there I thought, as a man with his priorities right. I've enjoyed renewing my interest in the game at Neath's home ground, the Knoll, an interest which in my youth involved running on rugby pitches, both as a player and in another capacity, which I will refrain from describing, Mr. Deputy Speaker, since the speech is made with your indulgence. I'm privileged in another way to follow two members, both survived by wives still living in Neath. Margaret Coleman is a highly respected figure in her own right in the community. Jenny Williams, now in her 90s, was a much-loved Labour Party activist, the wife of D.J. Williams, who hailed from the close-knit village of Tygwaith in the northwest of the constituency. And in 1925, D.J. Williams wrote of the destructive impact of capitalism in the coal industry, in terms which remain disgracefully true today. Donald Coleman's tragically premature death was not just a bitter blow to his family, it deprived Neath of a favourite son and this House of its finest tenor. And although I will do my best to follow in his footsteps as a diligent constituency MP, I'm afraid I cannot hope to match his talent for music and for song. The exuberance with which he sang and preached his love for Neath reflects the intense civic pride in the town and in the villages of the Dillais, Swansea, Ammon, Neath and Pelena valleys. But local residents can't survive on civic pride, mutual aid and mutual cooperation alone. They take great pride in educational achievements, and I have to say that I've met nobody in Neath who can't remember how many O-levels he or she has. There's a great tradition of skill. There's a great tradition of skill and hard work in Neath and its valleys, and much has been done in the face of government indifference and neglect. But so much more could be done if the publicly sponsored investment in industry, infrastructure and initiative for which the people of Neath and its valleys are crying out was provided. Surely Neath is entitled to the seed corn investment, decent training provision, and long-term loan finance which only national government or the Welsh Office is able to provide. The old Blaenant colliery site, headgear still erect as a monument to the last pit in Neath, one of over 30 to close in the constituency in the last 30 years, nestles beneath the village of Crynant in the picturesque Dillais Valley. The old Aberpergam washery and pit site is just below the little village of Cwmgrach in the Vale of Neath. Both are prime industrial sites, yet both stand idle, black and gaunt, wasting away, their potential wasting away as 11 people chase every job vacancy in the constituency, as training places are cut to the bone and businesses go bust. Nobody in Neath wants a free ride, simply the opportunity to build a new future. And that future must include high-quality health and community care provision. With its history of mining and heavy industry, the people of Neath suffer disproportionately from ill health. And with a higher than average proportion of citizens of pensionable age, 22%, compared with 17.7% for Great Britain as a whole, there's a particular need for a properly funded health and community care network. Yet the Welsh Office and the Treasury have still not given the go-ahead for the new hospital which Neath so desperately needs. And West Glamorgan County Council has been forced, under pain of poll tax capping, to close one of its old people's homes. And Neath Borough Council, meanwhile, has had to spend an extra £523,000 on collecting the poll tax compared with the cost of collecting the rates. And on top of this, the borough has had to install a new computer system for processing the poll tax at a cost of £300,000. Neath's 16,000 pensioners are entitled to question the priorities of a society and a government which wastes such colossal sums of money whilst hospital waiting lists grow and responsible for community care is unceremoniously dumped on local authorities without the necessary resources to finance it. How can we claim to be caring for citizens in need when the iniquity of the poll tax continues to penalise them so savagely? Even after the recent £140 reduction in the poll tax, residents in the Blind Hondon area of Neath will still be paying £113.66p a head. This is £85 more, incidentally, than I pay as a resident in Resolven, a few miles up the Neath Valley, even though we're paying for the same local authority services because of the discriminatory way in which the Welsh Office operates its transitional relief scheme. And one resident in the Blind Hondon area, a woman from Bryncow, is caring for her 83-year-old mother who suffers from Parkinson's disease. Her mother has a tiny widow's pension and has to pay the full £113. Their combined household poll tax bill is £339, yet both she and her husband are on tiny incomes so widespread in the Neath area. The hypocrisy of preaching community care whilst practicing such a pernicious policy is not lost on this woman or her neighbours in Neath. And those over there who turn a blind eye to her predicament call to mind Thomas Paine's summer soldiers and sunshine patriots who in a crisis shrink from the service of their country. And how can this House claim to be safeguarding the interests of individuals such as a 72-year-old man from the village of Gwauncaigurwen, where the Welsh language is spoken with such pride? His eyesight deteriorates daily, for he has waited 18 months for a cataract operation. This is a simple, cheap operation, yet waiting lists for ophthalmic surgery at Singleton Hospital have doubled since 1987, and there are now 1,400 local people like him waiting inpatient treatment. And perhaps most outrageous of all, he was told he could have the operation next week if he could go private at a cost of £3,000. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, he might as well have been invited to go to the moon, but that is a sum quite out of the question for someone like him living on the pittance that pensioners now have to get. And he can be forgiven for noting, with some anger, the grotesque fact that 200 people, just 0.004% of the population, now monopolize 9.3% of the country's economic wealth. Some classless society indeed. And meanwhile, the quality of the environment and the standard of living continues to deteriorate, especially for our elderly. Local bus services in the Neath Valleys have been cut ruthlessly. Fares are exorbitant, yet who can afford a car and a basic retirement income, perhaps topped up by a tiny miner's pension? It's difficult enough for senior citizens to pay their colour television licence and the standing charges on their phone, their electricity or their gas. It's difficult enough to find enough money to eat properly as food bills rise remorselessly while the real value of their pensions declines compared with wage earners. And if Neath senior citizens had free bus passes, if standing charges on basic utility services were reduced or abolished for pensioners, if those on low incomes were entitled, like their colleagues in sheltered housing, to television licences for £5 rather than £77, if Neath and Flew Borough Councils were not banned by the government from using their combined housing capital receipts of £7.6 million to build new homes, and hit by cuts in housing finance from installing universal central heating and upgrading their existing housing stock, if communities like Cwmlynfech, at the heads of the 4 main valleys in the constituency, were not choked by coal dust, disruption, and heavy lorry traffic from existing and threatened open-cast mines, if all these vital factors were addressed, then the standard of quality of life of my constituents would be dramatically improved, and with it, there would be less need to depend on health and community care provision. Furthermore, Mr. Deputy Speaker, if the curse of London knows best were removed, local people would of their own volition radically recast their priorities. That is why decentralisation of power through newly invigorated local councils and an elected assembly for Wales is so vital. That's why a Freedom of Information Act and an elected second chamber is so essential. The voice of the people must be heard, not smothered by anachronistic and elitist institutions of government. Finally, Mr. Deputy Speaker, can I say that during the last 12 years especially, Britain has become an I'm all right Jack society, putting instant consumption before long-term investment, selfish me-firstism before community care, private greed before public good. The result is ugly to behold. The tawdry tinsel of decadence camouflaging a society rotten at the roots. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I thank the House for its indulgence, or as we say in Neath, diolch yn fawr.